Hello, cult hackers, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm her dad, Stephen Mather. I was a member of a high control group or cult up until I was about 30 when Celine came along. These days, I'm an organisational psychologist. I'm very interested in the whole question of high control and coercive control and all of that stuff. So welcome to the podcast, everybody. We're very happy to have a guest today about a subject that we haven't talked about before. So first of all, welcome, Abby, to the podcast.
Hi, very nice to be here.
It's great to have you. So, Abby, you are somebody that's experienced what I guess the umbrella term is the troubled teen industry. And this is something that we've not talked about really at all, I don't think, on our podcast, which is probably a mistake. So it's high time we did speak to somebody about it. So you're somebody who's experienced that. So maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about your experience with that, and then we can get into what it is and a bit more of the history about it, if that's okay, Abby.
Yeah, of course. So I'll give just kind of a brief overview of the industry, just so that, you and your listeners kind of know what I'm talking about a little bit. The troubled teen industry is basically a network of behavior modification programs that are privately owned for the most part and very under-regulated. So that allows for a lot of abuse and neglect to occur, and even deaths in these programs. It's usually very manipulative and money-driven, and they primarily exist within the United States, although there are programs overseas, many of which are created by Americans. But for the most part, it's a very American industry. So yeah, I was 15 and I was sent to two of these programs. I spent a total of 16 months in Utah, which is a hotspot for these programs because of its lack of regulation and, oversight of these programs. I would say Utah has the most programs by far of any other state, but, you also see pockets in Idaho, Montana, Texas, Florida, places that also have pretty lax regulations.
Okay, so just tell us a bit more about your experience with it then. So obviously you've had a brush with this industry. So do you want to tell us how that happened?
Yeah. So I've just always been an anxious person. I've had anxiety for pretty much my entire life. It got worse when I went through puberty, just became a lot more unmanageable. And I also developed depression. And also with that started self-harming, just was not in a good place mentally. My parents tried to help me, brought me to psychiatrists, psychologists, which basically they just put me on a bunch of meds. There weren't a lot of resources for mental health for teens where I was living at the time. I was in Australia, and my parents just tried everything that they could, but there really wasn't anything for them to do. And a couple months before I moved back to America, I was assaulted at a party, which kind of spiraled everything and just made me the worst that I had been. So when my family moved back to California, only a couple days later, I met with a psychiatrist who kind of put me in a 5150, which involuntary hold in the psych ward.
Okay.
So I was there for a week. They put me on a ton of meds, and that was pretty much it. Released me. I was a zombie. I was on like 7 or 8 different medications when I got out. Really didn't feel like myself. Stopped going to school. Just was having a really hard time. I think I needed like a little bit of a break. So I wanted to go back into the psych ward just for like a break kind of thing, because I was overwhelmed with life. I was feeling a lot of pressure from my parents to go to school, and I really couldn't manage it. So I got hospitalized again, and had I known that that would lead to me not going home for 15 months, I definitely would have done things differently. But during my second hospitalization, the psychiatrist told my parents that they should hire an educational consultant, which is a common route that kids take to get into this industry. It's basically somebody who, quote unquote, specializes in therapeutic placements. So he, tried to get my parents to send me to a wilderness program. I told my parents if they sent me anywhere, I was going to kill myself. So that kind of disqualified me from going to wilderness. Instead, he convinced them to send me to a lockdown facility in Utah. I spent 3 months there, but pretty much as soon as I arrived at this place, I knew that it was going to be a very bad experience and a very different experience than what I was expecting. The first thing that happened when I arrived, I was transported, 2 people showed up in my hotel room, took me in the middle of the night. When I arrived, I was, really tired. I was still super drugged up, kind of disoriented from waking up at 4 a.m. and jumping on a plane. The first thing that happened was 2 staff members took me into a bathroom, locked the door, and told me that I had to get naked. And I was immediately felt a panic attack just because, not only am I a 15-year-old girl who just is insecure and doesn't like being naked in front of anybody, but, I'd also been assaulted, and these are 2 strangers. I'm in a new state. I have no way of contacting my family, just really freaking out. And I kind of, was like, hey, I'm really not comfortable with that. Is there something else we can do? Maybe I can take my clothes off and you give me a gown and then you come back in the room, or, trying to kind of negotiate other ways. Cause that's what they did at the psych ward. The people at the psych ward never saw me naked. But I don't remember how they exactly said it, but the gist of it was, you're going to take your clothes off or we're going to take them off for you. So I immediately was like, oh, this is not the place that I thought it was. I really thought that I was going to some place like the psych ward, just a little bit longer term, but it ended up being completely different. Yeah, so. Well,
that sounds absolutely awful, Abby. I'm so sorry you went through that, and the lead up to that is horrific. So sorry. My first thought is, Celine, I want to get your reaction to that because you're a young woman. What's your first thoughts when you hear that story?
Well, it's just awful, mortifying. Like you said, even in instances where you get given a gown and that sort of thing, that in that instance when I'd been ill myself, that was still panic inducing at that point. When I'd been ill and someone gave me the gown, I was like, oh, this is happening, and that went into shock. So for it to be even more brutal is horrendous. And I guess the other thing that's screaming in my head is, how is this legal? Is it legal? How is it happening? It
unfortunately is legal, which is ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I don't even know how to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, so let me just I just want to collect my thoughts about what's happened. So you've had what should we call it, an episode, a feeling of intense anxiety. You've had a total experience that's aggravated this as well. You want some help. You're looking for help. When they suggest this place, this educational consultant recommends this place, how do you feel about that at the time before you get there? Do you feel quite positive about it, or what's your feelings on that?
So I was very opposed to being sent anywhere, just because I didn't want to be sent to Utah. I didn't want to spend time in a program, but I did know that I needed help, and my parents seemed really enthusiastic that this would help me, and I wanted to try for them. And that was after the initial anger that I felt when they told me they were sending me away. I actually tried to get emancipated because when you're in the psych ward, they give you a little book with all your rights, and one of them is you can talk to a lawyer. So I called the lawyer. Obviously didn't go anywhere because I was a 15-year-old in the psych ward. But my parents told me, you're going to be going to a, month-long program. It'll be in Utah, but don't worry, we can call you every day and it'll only be a month. And, they're going to do all these tests and figure out, what's wrong with you and what medications to put you on. And so I kind of expected it to be just like the psych ward, but a little bit longer and a little further away from my parents. When in reality, it was nothing like that at all. And, instead of staying a month, I stayed for 3 months and then had another 13 months at another program afterwards.
Wow. So there's there's two parallel universities here. There's one that is being told your parents and that's being relayed to you. And then there's the reality. Do you want to carry on talking about the reality and then perhaps we'll come back to the way it was sold or missold? Let's pick up your story if we can from you've just got there and tell us what happens next.
Yeah, so I was very medicated, so I remember more just general stuff about the program more than like chronological days and events. But it was a very small facility. I think there were about between 12 and 18 of us there at any given time. It was a lockdown facility, so big metal door with tons of locks on it, very secure. We had to get patted down every time we walked into or out of a room. All of our rooms and bathrooms and pretty much every door was locked at all times. One of the, I guess, we talked about my initial strip search, but one of the more damaging things that I experienced when I was there was that because I had a history of self-harm, I had to be strip searched 3 times a week. And that was often performed by male staff just because, a male was on the staff and he was like, I'm a medical professional, don't worry. But, these weren't medical professionals. These were college students or people who had just graduated college, taking a 15-year-old into the bathroom and, making her get naked. So,
terrific.
Yeah, which, I mean, there's no way that's legal, but I guess somehow it is. And they also had a seclusion room, which was conveniently located right across the hallway from my room, which was basically just a small room with white tiles and, concrete floor with a drain in it. And that was used as solitary confinement in this program. It was honestly like, yeah, it was horrendous. Every time you would hear someone in there, they would just be screaming and banging their heads on the wall. And, I would try to pretend not to hear it, just stay in my room, pretend to read a book. But, it's really hard to ignore that kind of thing. I was, someone was put in there my first couple days. So that's when I kind of knew, like, I got to never act out in this program. Right. I don't want to go in there. So, I from the beginning had this mindset of I'm going to do what they tell me. I'm going to do what they say. I'm not going to act out. I'm not going to be a bad kid. I want to go home, because I started seeing that a lot of the people I was there with weren't going home afterwards. They were going on to longer therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, things like that. And I was like, not me, though. My parents told me I'm coming home after, like, totally delusional, but I really thought that I would be going home, not realizing that this place that I was at, part of what they do is make recommendations to parents about next steps.
Right.
And they never recommend a kid go home afterwards. It's always go to a longer term program. It's kind of a pipeline into longer term trouble teen programs.
So I think I know the answer to this, Abby. Why do you think that is? Why do you believe that is?
Well, I know why it is for the program I was sent to specifically. It's because it's owned by the same parent company. But, I think that similar to educational consultants, there are kickbacks that are received for a lot of these programs. A lot of educational consultants receive kickbacks that are not disclosed. And, you know, I guess it makes them look more professional, and I guess they also take a better safe than sorry kind of, you know, stance with it of like, well, they may as well benefit from this. And, you know, maybe they're sending a kid to a program that they've never been to, and they just assume that it's helpful, even though, you know, this kid is going to be traumatized and worse off when they get out than when they went in.
So during your time, obviously it's kind of sold that you'd be able to speak to your parents and that sort of thing. Was that actually something you got, or was that one of the things that was another lie?
No, that was another lie. I think when I was there, so we were able to send letters, but they would be read by staff before sent out, and, you know, they would monitor them. We didn't get phone calls that I recall. I think the only times I talked to my parents were pretty close to the end of my stay, when I had like a call with my therapist and, you know, my parents, and they were telling me that I was going to be sent away. And that was the most helpless that I've ever felt in my entire life, because, you know, here I am having just been through a horrible experience for 2 to 3 months. I think it was close to 3 months. My parents don't believe me. They think I'm a horrible kid. They think that I need to go to a long-term program, which they told me at the time was going to be about 6 to 8 months. Another lie. I don't know if they were lying purposely or if that's what the ed consultant told them, but it was not 6 to 8 months. But I was freaking out at that. I was trapped in this lockdown facility in another state. I had no way of talking to my parents, just me and them, you know. It was always going to be monitored by staff members. I was always going to be accused of being manipulative if I tried to say anything bad about the program. Yeah, it was just a very high control environment. And I just remember, I'll never forget that feeling of helplessness.
So just to so just get the timeline right. So you spent sort of around 3 months at this first place, and then do you come home and then go to another one, or do you go straight to a different one?
I went straight to the second program, located only about a 5-minute drive down the same road, which again speaks to the density of these programs in Utah. Yes. You pretty much can't drive 20 minutes without seeing at least one. And yeah, that was another one of probably the worst days of my life. I wasn't transported by like an actual transport company this time because it was such a short trip. I was feeling initially hopeful about the program because I had heard that, you know, it's not a lockdown, so it's less strict. You know, my therapist been pulled up their website, and we looked through their website together, and it didn't seem like a bad place. It definitely, you know, they talk about being relationship based and, you know, holistic approach and all these buzzwords that make it sound like it's going to be kind of hippy dippy, you know, like healing and whatever. But again, that's pretty much immediately when I got there was not the reality. Basically, again, I was strip searched, although they gave you a towel to hold up this time. So it wasn't just like fully, you know, but, you know, the staff still looked over the towel. So it was just kind of like there for like a sense of security. And they operated using a level system, which is very common in these types of programs. Basically, you know, different phases that you have to work your way up through by completing assignments and meeting goals, like, you know, with your therapy and, you know, community work and everything like that. So when you get there, you're on orientation and basically have no privileges whatsoever. You have to be arm's length with the staff member at all times. You're not allowed to speak to anybody without that staff member listening, which, you know, they're right next to you, so they are going to be listening. Can't read books, can't, you know, walk around by yourself, can't go to the bathroom unsupervised, like just very invasive. I met with my therapist the first couple days that I was there, and she was the worst. She was like literally one of the meanest people that I've ever met in my life.
It's can I just ask you, these therapists that you're dealing with both of these places, are these qualified registered therapists?
They are. Most
They
of
are.
them are
Okay.
LCSWs
Okay.
or LMFTs. But I will say that this industry, there's a pipeline from Brigham Young University in Utah. A lot of the staff members there come from BYU, and they're all kind of trained in the same type of heavily Mormon therapy, to put it that way. There's a lot of Mormon beliefs factored into their beliefs. Understandably, you know, they're Mormon, but a lot of the kids that were there were not Mormon. And, you know, it was kind of just weird to have a lot of those Mormon beliefs pushed onto us all the time. My therapist, Melissa, she was an LMFT, and she, like, one of the first things that you do before you're allowed to progress forward in the program at all is you have to write a letter of accountability, which is also something that's very common in these programs. Basically just taking accountability for everything that you did. You have to send it to your parents after it's approved by a therapist, and, you know, they send you back an impact letter, which is, you know, how all of your actions affected them. And it's a really hard process. I had to rewrite my letter of accountability several times because my therapist refused to send it until I had taken accountability for being sexually assaulted because I was drinking at the time. So that was kind of when I realized, like, oh, this is not going to be a good therapist for me. This is not a good experience, because, like, I think a lot of people who have been assaulted struggle with the thoughts of, like, it's my fault. What could I have done? How could I have prevented it? And, you know, logically, just from, you know, other therapists that I had seen and stuff, I knew that it wasn't my fault. And I thought that she was going to help reinforce that in me instead of, you know, telling me the exact opposite. No, it is your fault. You need to take accountability for it. You were drinking. If you hadn't been, it wouldn't have happened. So that was a really fun process for me.
It's terrible. Terrible.
Yeah.
So how long did you have to stay there, Abby?
13 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in total, how long did you spend in these places, did you say?
About 16 months.
About 16 months.
Yeah.
So you come back after this, I guess, at some point they decide that you're either the gravy train has run long enough, or they think you're well enough to go back home. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so there was basically 3 ways you could leave. You could get pulled by your parents, you could turn 18 and sign yourself out, or you could graduate. I was 15 when I went in. There was no way that I was spending, you know, I was about to be 16, but there was no way that I was spending 2 years there. I was just like, I'm not going to wait it out. There's no way my parents are going to pull me, because they made that very clear. Anytime I tried to bring up any negative thing during our visits and stuff, they would just be like, you're manipulating us, you know, why, you know, you're being so manipulative, blah, blah, blah. They'd tell my therapist, or, you know, whatever, and I'd be punished when I got back. So I basically realized that the only way for me to leave was to graduate. So eventually I just gave up with, you know, trying to get out. I conformed. I did exactly what they told me to do. I became very brainwashed because, of course, you know, you don't have any privileges. You're taken, all your rights are taken away. And then when you start making, like, you know, quote unquote progress, they start giving you privileges back, and you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. Like, you know, it's kind of like a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing where you're like, you know, oh, I see, like, you know, they're tough on us, but I see why they have to be, and, you know, all this stuff. So I kind of became like, I just became brainwashed like a little robot, you know. And I progressed through all the levels. There were 7 levels. 13 months is actually one of the quicker stays there. People, the longest that I've heard of was a girl was there for 4 years, from the time that she was 14 to 18. And then she went to their aftercare program, which I can't imagine how damaging that is. But yeah, I graduated from there. They had this little ceremony for me to just be like, oh, great. And then I got back home to California, and none of my school credits transferred because their school was BS.
Yeah, not
and I
a
had to
genuine school.
Yep, and I had to repeat the my junior year because none of my credits would transfer over. But yeah, that's basically how I got out.
So I'm curious about, and again, you don't have to talk about this, anything you don't want to talk about, that's cool. But in terms of how your parents responded when you got back and how you responded to being back with your parents, I'm guessing you felt pretty angry with them. Or maybe you didn't because you were brainwashed. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, how that all kind of happened when you got back and got into normal life?
Yeah, so I think initially when I got out, I was very brainwashed and I felt, that, I'm so grateful for my parents. This is the best thing that they could have done for me. Look how great I am now. Just really repressing all of the traumatic things that had happened while I was there. A girl nearly died while I was there because of medical neglect, like literally 10 to 20% chance of survival is what she had when she was at the hospital. I watched kids get restrained almost daily, locked in the basement, had to just be constantly humiliated. We, had attack therapy groups where people would berate you over tiny little things that you did. And, I had to do that to other people. I had to berate people as well, because that's one of the hardest things for me processing is the trauma that I've inflicted on others because I was forced to. And that's why I don't hold any resentment towards any of the people at the program, any of the residents at the program, because the things that they did and said to me, they were just doing so that they could go home and they could progress. And I totally understand that. My parents, when I first got out, yes, I was brainwashed. That lasted about 6 months. And I got out when I was about to turn 17. Yeah, I was about to turn 17 when I got out. And I was just really terrified of being sent back because I'd heard about that happening to other people. I'd actually seen a girl who graduated be sent back, and that terrified me. I did not want that to happen to me. So I pretty much was on a mission to be like the perfect daughter. Went to bed early, did all my homework, got straight A's, never like lied to them or snuck out or drank or smoked or anything. Like I was just on a mission to be as perfect as possible. But, the brainwashing started coming undone around 6 months after I got out. I opened up to my boyfriend at the time about what I had experienced because he kind of felt something was fishy and was like, hey, you said you were at a boarding school. What boarding school? Blah, blah. I eventually told him just very small amounts of information about it, because that's one of the things they told you. Don't tell anybody where you were. Don't tell them about your experience. They'll think you're crazy. They won't understand. You'll push them away. So it was very ingrained in me of like, I can't tell anybody about this. I can't talk about my experience. And I told him just very small amounts of information, and he was like shocked and like started crying. I felt really bad because I was like, I didn't even realize that this was like that bad. But once that started becoming a little bit undone, I was actually taking a memoir class in high school at that time. And I asked my teacher if I could write a little bit about my experience, just like to make sure it wasn't like too heavy or anything. And I wrote a short little memoir for that class and asked my parents if they wanted to read it. And, they were very defensive about their decision at first. I think when they realized the truth of what happened to me in there, they immediately, how can you not feel defensive and feel, really upset that, you put your kid through that? And I totally get that. I don't have any resentment towards them. I had brief periods of anger for their decision, but, overall, they didn't know the truth of what was happening in there. They didn't know what I was going through. And if they had, I know they would not have sent me there. So, I really don't hold any resentment towards them for that. And they know that now.
I suppose coming off of that with, the fact that obviously the things were being kept from them, I suppose that's where the legalities, I suppose, as well, I get even more confused with, because I suppose they're kind of hiding under you at the time were a minor, so they were using your parents' sort of guardianship as their reasoning why they could get away with doing things. But if they don't know what's happening and they're your guardians, how is that? I don't understand how that can exist. Is it just because it's not been spoken about enough, or what do you think?
I think that part of it is that, we really aren't allowed to speak to our parents in an unmonitored way. We would get one short phone call each week that was, monitored by staff. They were listening to us, and they could hang it up at any time if they wanted to. Like one girl found out her dog died and started like crying and, begging her mom to take her home because she loved that dog so much. And staff just grabbed the phone, hung up, and, she wasn't allowed to call home for a few weeks after that because, she had tried to be manipulative. And, there's actually, I got a copy of the parent handbook that they give to our parents. And there's an entire section in there. It's called The Window of Opportunity. And it's all about how to respond to us when we inevitably beg to come home. And it gives even examples of things that we might say, which most of them are pretty accurate to like what was actually going on. Staff are creepy. The food is bad. They're not feeding me enough. The people here are really mean. My therapist is horrible. All these things that are pretty valid complaints from my experience there. And, they basically give you a cookie cutter response to, wow, that sounds really tough. How are you going to deal with that? And, they basically prep our parents that we're going to try to manipulate them. That's just comes with the territory.
Yeah.
So, of course, when we actually bring up these abuses, they don't believe us. They say, oh, yeah, we've been prepped for this.
That's right. That's so fascinating, isn't it? And that is so similar to other coercive situations where, they're prepared in advance to field these sorts of questions. That's really interesting and horrible, of course.
If you're enjoying the podcast, you can support it by becoming a patron. You can support the podcast for just £1 or $1.50 and receive a variety of Patreon benefits as a thank you. Don't forget to share the podcast, follow, like, subscribe, and rate the podcast on the podcast app you're using. A review is particularly helpful as it gets us recognised by new listeners. And finally, if you'd like to reach out to us and tell us about some cult hacking you've been involved in, or you just want to say hi, you can do so by going to culthackers.com and using the contact form. We love hearing from our cult hackers. Thank you for listening, and now back to the podcast.
Obviously, all of this is not on the website, is it? So how do they? How? What's the outside philosophy? How do they sell these things? And I guess I want to ask you about your views about whether we lump all these sorts of wilderness groups and away groups and all of these things into the same bucket, because I have no idea. So I want to get your thoughts on that. But also, how do they the sorts of thing that you experienced? How is that sold to people? What's the way that people think this is going to be a good thing?
The basic way that the TTI brings in its clientele is it preys on desperate parents who are worried about their kids and pretty much give them you need to send your kid here or they're going to die. They're going to be dead in a mental hospital or in jail if you don't send them to this program. A lot of programs are like market themselves in very deceptive ways online. There were a few companies in the early 2000s that would, pretty much scam parents and pretend to be independent referral services when really, they were a company that owned 20 programs, and they would just be like, oh, it sounds like your kid is, really struggling. Here, we have a perfect program for you right here. And it's one of the ones they own. So there have historically been a lot of deceptive marketing practices. Today, I think with the internet the way that it is, they are a lot more sneaky. They use a lot of words like relationship-based, holistic, safe healing, all these things avoid a lot of the labels of behavior modification, which is what these programs are. But they don't like to use that word because, it sounds like boot campy. And, a lot of desperate parents these days aren't looking to send their kids to boot camps like they have been historically.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's quite a few different branches of the TTI. Obviously, there's residential treatment centers, therapeutic boarding schools, which accept, I guess, less serious issues as well. Like it was a lot of pretty severe issues, suicide, self-harm, eating disorders, PTSD, anxiety, depression, things like that. But, there were also kids there that were there because they snuck out and their parents had enough, there are wilderness programs, which are, kind of the shorter term, backpacking, nightmares that a lot of kids in the media have been talking out about, which is incredible. And those programs just seem like hell. I do feel lucky that I was spared from going there. And, there are also a lot of religious programs, which are very seldom regulated because they, largely exist in states with religious exemptions that say, oh, no, you don't need to be licensed by the state as long as you're religious, because they argued that it would impede their religious freedom. And one sector of it that I don't think is talked about enough are these programs that primarily, instead of, taking private pay kids from their parents, having their parents pay, are kids who are sent from the juvenile justice system and the foster care system. There are lots of kids who are sent into these programs. If you're in the foster care system and you have, mental health issues, like a lot of these kids do, instead of trying to find a foster home that will take this kid, they'll just send them to this program because they don't know any better. These courts think that, oh, this will be a great therapeutic experience. Instead, these kids are abused. Same thing with the court system. A lot of times, juvenile offenders, the judges will say, you can either spend a month in juvie or you can attend this treatment program. And, not knowing any better, they pick the treatment program, not knowing that they'll be there for 2 years instead of a month, and it'll be way worse than juvie. And they'll leave worse than they went in. So there's a lot of different branches of it. I think the one that's been getting the most media attention are obviously like wilderness programs and these therapeutic boarding school, residential treatment center type places.
I suppose, having a background in psychology, I'm interested in how they try to explain the psychology of what's happening here. So why do they think this is going to work? What do they think they are actually doing? Let's for a moment give them the most charitable view possible. Let's say they actually are, most of them or some of them are trying to help. How do they think this is helping? What's their philosophy?
Their philosophy is basically that they will break you down in order to build you back up as a better person.
Okay.
That's kind of the general philosophy that I've picked up, which, may work for some people with really, like narcissistic personality disorder or things like that. People who have been in trouble with, violent crimes, things like that. There's even, some evidence that drug addiction, like, going back to the Synanon style of drug therapy, that organization, before it became a violent cult, found a lot of success in healing heroin addicts through this use of attack therapy, of breaking them down, building them back up. The problem with this industry is that it's not just those types of people that are sent here. There are people who were abused. There are people who are really depressed and have extremely low self-esteem, people with eating disorders, people, all types of people who breaking you down. Like when I went in there, I was already broken. I didn't need to be broken down anymore.
For somebody who's suffering anxiety, that is, I'm not a therapeutic psychologist, but it doesn't sound like the right approach to me. I mean, I would question whether in any circumstances that is actually a useful approach. You need to do proper control studies to see very different cohorts, as you say. Lumping everybody together, though, including people with anxiety, seems very, very strange, and is unlikely to have any positive effects, isn't it?
Yeah.
It feels like there's a lot of I think you said it already, kind of blame onto the people that are actually going through difficult really difficult times, and the pointing as though it's all like it's a choice that's positioned in that way towards the parents. It's like as though these children are manipulative, and it makes it sound like there's a bunch of kids choosing. And why on earth would anyone choose to be struggling to a degree that they get put in this place? And if they could just turn it off, why wouldn't they? Because everyone wants to go home.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned there Synanon, and that I guess is often quoted as, in a way, if not the beginning, one of the sort of early phases of this sort of mentality. And you've also mentioned attack therapy. So maybe we cover off those two things a little bit, and because as you said in our little pre-chat, you do a lot of studying afterwards, don't you, when you've been in a group like this of all sorts, and you start to learn the history. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of how we end up with these sorts of organizations?
Definitely. So the first kind of programs that I would say feed into the modern troubled teen industry were just a series of kind of like therapeutic wilderness camps, started in the 1940s, 1950s, and I think the interesting thing about the troubled teen industry is that there have been several kind of different roads that have converged into what we think of as the modern troubled teen industry, and all of them have brought slightly different tactics and methods that are still around today. The most talked about is definitely Synanon. It was a cult that wasn't always a cult. It was founded as a drug rehabilitation program in 1958, I believe, by Chuck Diedrich. And he was an ex-alcoholic, who was a big, speaker at AA meetings. He took acid as part of a UCLA study on the effects of LSD on alcoholics, and had a spiritual awakening, some might say, decided to start his own drug rehabilitation program. Started kind of as an alcoholic program, but word got around, and drug addicts, or dope fiends as he called them, started showing up. And he basically believed that AA wasn't tough enough. That people could go to these meetings and they could say, oh, I haven't drank in 60 days, but there was no one checking in on that. And maybe someone saw them stumbling down the street a couple days ago, and there was no way to confront them and say, hey, I saw you were drinking yesterday, or whatever. So Chuck kind of wanted this open forum group where people could confront each other in a very honest and confrontational way. So that's basically where the idea of attack therapy began, of pointing out someone's flaws very meanly and very publicly, in the hope that this will, reveal some great truth about them and change their ways. So, eventually, as most groups started by narcissists do, became a cult. And that, they eventually tried to murder a lawyer who was, coming after them, put a snake in his mailbox, a lot of other very horrific things, forcing men to get vasectomies, women to get abortions, shaving their followers' heads, stockpiling guns and ammunition, all the great hallmarks of a classic cult.
Yes.
Eventually, they were disbanded in 1991 by the LAPD, which is very lucky that they're not around anymore. But, one of the first really one of the first big companies of the troubled teen industry, CEDU, was founded by a Synanon member. And the name CEDU, CEDU, is how it's spelled. A lot of people speculate that it stands for Charles E. Diederich University, because Chuck Diederich, the founder of Synanon, was often referred to as CED. So, and of course, they tried to deny that once it became a cult. But yeah, definitely some interesting connections there.
Okay, so we've got this CEDU then, which is where do they start to target a wider range of people then? So it sounds like Synanon is more adults. These are alcoholics or people suffering with drug addiction.
Yeah.
And then it starts to spread to a more sort of to a wider group, including children.
So the founder of CEDU was Mel Wasserman. He was a Synanon member, but he wasn't a drug addict. He was a square, who is someone who just joined for the alternative lifestyle.
But they had names for people. So people that joined that weren't addicts were called squares.
Yeah, you're either a dope fiend or a square. Okay. And Mel Wasserman was a square. And he, really was just a fan of Chuck's teachings and his method of therapy. And he thought, maybe I could create my own programs for this, but work with, younger kids, the teenagers that he saw, dropping out of school and smoking dope and all this stuff that, was a big fear at the time. It was, the 60s, the mid 60s, late 60s. And that's kind of how he created CEDU. A lot of things were very similar. There were groups, attack therapy groups called RAPs, where the kids were made to scream at each other, and very similar to the Synanon style attack therapy. Haircuts, both metaphorical and actual. If kids really misbehaved, they would cut their hair. Lots of it was basically a copy paste of Synanon, but for kids. Sounds and like the thing about Synanon was most of the people who were there chose to be there. They joined to get help. And with Synanon or CEDU, it was the opposite.
Yeah.
Those kids, that was kind of the first time that parents were actually sending their kids there. And they kind of, created transport companies a little bit. Some programs were doing that.
So I just want to pick up on that phrase, transport companies. That sounds like, like a fairly benign taxi service, but the transport companies are these thugs that show up in the middle of the night and threaten you, aren't they?
Yep. They're goons is what kind of, the colloquial term is. But I guess I was lucky because I kind of knew that I was being transported, but many kids don't. They're basically these people who just show up one day one night in the middle of your room, like when you're asleep. A lot of people literally go to bed just thinking it's a normal night, and they wake up and there's two people standing at the foot of their bed at 3 a.m. saying, "Hey, come with us." They have handcuffs, zip ties, pepper spray, things like that. And kids don't even know they're going anywhere. They think they're being kidnapped, which
so I've
traumatic way to
it's terrible. I've obviously listening to some documentaries about this subject. You can either do it the easy way, the hard way keeps coming up as a phrase that they say, and there's nothing other than this is kidnapping, isn't it? This is forcible removal from your home. It's shocking.
It's like, how is that bit sold? Like, because obviously someone's got to let them in or whatever. Like, how is that bit? Is it just, okay, this is important, that you've got to get them on board, this is part of it? How do you sell that to the parent? Because it starts pretty heavy.
Yeah, I think the way that it's sold to many parents is, if their kids have any issues with running away or things like that, they say, if you tell them that they're going to this program, they'll never go. They'll run away, and, you have to sneak up on them. You have to ambush them when they least expect it, when they're asleep in the middle of the night. And that's, I think, I know for my parents, it was sold as it'll be more effective if you don't take her, than which, now I kind of realize is because had they taken me, they would have seen it. They would have visited and seen exactly what was going on there. So I think they try to create that distance between parents and the programs, so that they don't have parents actually know what's going on. And I think it's sold as kind of like this is going to be the best thing for your kid because, they'll be safe and these people are professionals who are trained and they can't run away from them. And, kids are often zip tied, handcuffed, restrained, things like that, just to get them to the program. And then,
But it's a statement of intent, isn't it? So obviously they sell it to the parents one way, but in reality, it's a statement of intent. It's a message to the child that we're in charge. You are subordinate. It's a power game that's being played here very, very clearly, and it starts at that moment.
It's like all of the cult stuff, all with all the models, like bike model and that sort of, it's all of that all at once, isn't it? Like it's the physical stuff, it's setting the tone, it isolates you straight away from anyone just all in one action there.
Yeah, seriously. It's kind of the introduction to the entire nightmare that all these people experience.
So we're coming to the end of our conversation. I mean, Abby, it's been absolutely fascinating. Awful, but really fascinating. You're talking very lucidly now about this experience, and we always like to have a positive note, I suppose. You have survived this experience, and you're able to talk about it. Tell us a little bit about that, how you managed to make sense of it all and get yourself together and be able to talk to us about it.
Well, it took a lot of time and a lot of work. I think when I started to come out of the brainwashing and, think about my experience in a more, clear way, the first thing that I wanted to do was just understand what I had been through. I felt so alone. I felt like I was the only person in the world who was thinking how I was. And it was so overwhelming to me once I figured out that this wasn't a good experience. So, I went online, did a little bit of research. It's kind of where I found out the connections between, the first program I went to and the second program, and, the rebrand that happened there. And I was just really interested in that whole thing. And I kind of started researching more. The more I researched, the more I found about all of these programs and their histories, and, the histories of not only the programs I went to and the companies that own them, but their connections to other programs like CEDU. Everything was connected in this crazy web that honestly, that's what helped me heal the most, was understanding that the things that happened to me, it wasn't because I was a bad kid. It wasn't because I, was this horrible monster who put my parents through so much. And I did put my parents through a lot, I will say that, but the kind of help that I needed was not what I got. And it took me a long time to believe that I didn't deserve this treatment. And through this research that I've been doing, it really has made it clear to me that this is just the way the industry is. You could be a straight A student, never done drugs, never had any issues with the police or with, your parents or anything, and you can still be sent to this. You just have to have kind of crazy parents who, are upset that you get a B. Like and you're going to be treated the same as someone who has been arrested for a crime, or someone who has been violent and acted out violently towards others. It's not a reflection of you as a person. It is a reflection of the industry. And that has been a big thing that I've come to realize that has changed how I think about my experience.
Yeah, because it's a system that's got a machine behind it, and as soon as you're put into that meat grinder, then that's the way it's going to operate on whoever gets put into that. So as you say, it doesn't really matter who you are, and you have no agency as a minor. You're, that's one of the horrific things about it. I did want to ask you about, clearly there's, I mean, in the UK particularly, of course, we have lots of boarding schools, although not as much as you might imagine. We're not all Harry Potter over here, but it has a tradition. The UK has a tradition of the boarding school, I suppose, for very wealthy people. And there's something called the Prince's Trust, which is a charity that lets kids go camping in sort of wilderness situations. I mean, as much wilderness as you can get in the UK. Are we worried about all of these? Is there any way of knowing whether there's experiences that are okay or dangerous? How can you help me with that? Because I don't understand that really.
So I think for me, when I'm hearing about a new place that might potentially be a TTI program, I'm the person who's been creating this database on Reddit, on the Troubled Teens subreddit. So that's kind of where all of my research goes. And sometimes people will come to me and say, hey, I just heard about this program. Is it a TTI program? One of the first places I look is at the reviews. If there's a lot of people, or, even a few people saying, this place is a scam, don't send your kid here, I was abused here, anything with the hallmarks of a TTI, anything I can read and say, hey, that sounds a lot about what I experienced or what I've read other people experienced, that's immediately a red flag for me.
Okay.
There are also a list of kind of red flags that you can find on the wiki and also on various other places online. I think Breaking Code Silence has it on their website, and Unsilenced also has a list of red flags. Like kind of the standard things: monitoring mail, limiting communication, the whole privilege level system thing, making kids admit to things that they didn't do. There's a lot of red flags on that list that would kind of signify that it's involved in the troubled teen industry. So I would say to start there, and I can provide that link to you if you want.
Yeah, I was going to say, send us any links that you think are useful and we'll put them on the show notes for people to follow. Yeah, that sounds really good. There's a few documentaries online about this topic. I suppose the celebrity Paris Hilton is the most well-known name that's become public about this particular issue. So I think she's spoken about this as well. So yeah, this is something I'm going to learn a lot more about.
Yeah, I can send you some more names of articles and documentaries and things.
Please.
There's quite a few out there.
That would be really good. Thank you.
Definitely, because I think, as you said, it's not with all of these things we talk about, coercive groups, cults and stuff. No one, I think loads of people have said no one joins a cult. I don't think people purposely send their kids to places they think are going to be awful. So knowing those red flags up front is really, really useful, because no one's jumping in and like, oh, cool, would be nice.
Definitely.
Fancy a bit of that,
Yeah, let's have my kid join a cult. That'll be good for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Abby, thank you so much for your time today and your the way you described that. I mean, very eloquent and so interesting. I've learned a lot today. You've had a horrific experience, but you've obviously you're able to talk about it in the way that you have. So thank you so much for joining us today on Cult Hackers, Abby.
Thank you for having me. It's been really nice to talk about this. I'm always happy to raise awareness. I think that's really where the most change is going to happen in this industry, is when enough people know about it that they stop sending kids there.
Right. Well, we'll certainly do our best to help with that. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.